A motel clerk disappears, leaving behind a trail of blood. Investigators have their suspect, but without a victim, what can they charge him with? A shooting is reported, but investigators have no proof that it really occurred. Until they can sift fact from fiction, they haven't got a case. Is a missing sofa the key to a woman's disappearance? The prosecution can't rest until it can make sense of a series of odd clues. Murder is usually the most obvious of crimes. The victims' bodies mute witnesses to violence. But their silent testimony may go unheard when they disappear without a trace. Memphis, Tennessee, a thriving southern city. Home of Beale Street, the Blues, and Elvis Presley. But in 1997, it played host to a deadly mystery. In the early morning hours of February 8th, a man arrived at a Memphis motel. He became concerned when calls to the front desk went unanswered. He went to check it out.
Hello?
The clerk appeared to be missing.
Hello?
He didn't see anyone in the lobby, but there was blood on the counter. The office security door was open, and he noticed more blood on the frame. Convinced something was wrong, he left and called police. When Memphis police arrived, they discovered blood outside the motel entrance. Smearing indicated something had been dragged across the pavement. They found more clues inside. While the office showed no sign of forced entry, the cash register was open and empty.
Where's the register out?
But a purse lying undisturbed nearby caught their attention. They didn't believe a woman would willingly leave it behind. The wallet inside still contained money, as well as a checkbook, credit cards, and driver's license in the name of Ricky Ellsworth. Alerted by police, the motel manager arrived and confirmed that Ricky Ellsworth was the clerk on duty. She said Ricky lived nearby with her husband, Don, and 2 children. A trusted, reliable employee, she wasn't the sort to just leave in the middle of her shift. Circumstances of the crime suggested more than robbery. Police suspected the clerk had been abducted. As police processed the scene, other significant details began to emerge. The office security door was equipped with a keypad, but it was open and showed no sign of tampering. Either someone had known the code or the clerk had unlocked the door. To investigators, that suggested Ricky Ellsworth might have known her abductor.
So fingerprints, those are going to be fingerprints.
Let's go check back.
Although police had begun to suspect foul play, nothing prepared them for what they found in an adjacent bathroom. There were signs of a desperate struggle and much more blood. The running sink contained a small flashlight, and the toilet seat had been ripped from its hinges. Wet, blood-tinged sheets indicated someone had tried to clean the room. Not only had Ricky Ellsworth disappeared, but it now seemed she'd been seriously injured. Captain R.G. Moore, who led the crime scene unit, feared the worst.
When we don't have a body and we don't know exactly what happened, we'd handle it just like it's going to be a homicide case. We process the scene, we collect our blood sample, we collect all the evidence we can find from the scene, and just keep it until we see what we got.
Investigators hoped the evidence would lead them to Ricky. A squad car brought the victim's husband, Don Ellsworth, to the motel. He said he and Ricky were happily married. He told police his wife was a kind person who worked with a Christian prison ministry in her spare time. Every Christmas, she baked pies for the prisoners. But Ellsworth said their marriage hadn't always been so tranquil. They'd once separated for 2 years, and she'd gotten involved with a man who assaulted her and went to prison for it. Ellsworth said the man's name was Michael Rimmer. After finishing at the scene, the investigators returned to the station to conduct a background check on Michael Rimmer. What they found in the files was chilling. Rimmer was a high school dropout with a history of drug problems and violence. In 1989, he was convicted of robbing and brutally assaulting Ricky Ellsworth. Details of Rimmer's previous assault on Ricky raised Detective Robert Shemwell's suspicions.
His actions at that crime basically mirrored what was happening here at the motel with the cleaning up, or attempt to clean up the evidence. We immediately began looking for Michael Rimmer.
Meanwhile, detectives narrowed the time frame for Ricky's disappearance. They found a couple who had checked in with her at 1:15 a.m. But when 2 others tried to check out around 2:30, she wasn't there. Detectives located a witness who said he pulled into the motel at approximately 2:15, hoping to rent a room. But he saw a man with bloody knuckles behind the counter and left without registering. He also noticed a 4-door maroon car backed up to the curb, its trunk and doors open. Based on his description, police put together a composite of the man at the motel. Using an identikit, a collection of facial parts and features that can be assembled as needed, the suspect's face came together. It resembled Michael Rimmer. Detectives then asked the witness to look through an album of more than 50 mugshots, including Rimmer's. Their hopes were dashed when he couldn't positively identify Rimmer as the man with the bloody knuckles. Detectives learned from a co-worker that Ricky had recently gotten a birthday card from a Michael in Mississippi. She took the card into the back office to read, but became angry and threw it away. It was becoming clear to detectives that if they wanted to find Ricky Ellsworth, they needed to find Michael Rimmer. They started at the auto repair shop where he worked. Nobody had seen him since Friday, the day before Ricky disappeared. He'd left his tools and paycheck behind. One more critical fact emerged.
When we got to talking to the employees there, this same maroon 4-door vehicle was described as being Michael Rimmer's car. So then we decided we need to track down and find out where Michael Rimmer got this 4-door maroon vehicle.
It wasn't registered to Rimmer. If it wasn't his, detectives wondered where he'd gotten it. His co-workers sent detectives to another friend of Rimmer's who told them that his own maroon 4-door car had been stolen a month earlier, shortly after he'd last seen Rimmer. After 4 days, Ricky Ellsworth was still missing, and so was Michael Rimmer. Hoping for a clue to his whereabouts, police questioned his brother. Richard Rimmer said he'd last seen Michael on the morning of February 9th, just hours after Ricky Ellsworth disappeared. Michael had seemed exhausted when he arrived in the maroon car around 9:30 a.m. He asked Richard if he knew how to remove a blood stain from the back seat. Then, Michael pulled a muddy shovel from the car and scraped mud from his boots. Richard also told police that Michael claimed Ricky bought the car for him. She had visited Rimmer in prison after he claimed he'd found God. And Richard knew the two had met after his release. But somewhere along the line, the friendship soured. By now, 2 weeks had passed, and still nobody had seen or heard from Ricky Ellsworth. Detectives had lost hope of finding her alive, and their prime suspect, Michael Rimmer, still eluded them. They would have to find him and the stolen car if they had any chance of proving murder.
I issued a theft of property warrant on Michael Rimmer and indicated in that warrant that when he was located, or if that vehicle was located, that it was to be held for the Memphis Homicide Unit and processed.
Detectives got a promising lead from one of Rimmer's former cellmates. He said Rimmer spoke of killing Ricky and burying her in Mississippi after he got out of prison. Rimmer's former girlfriend told detectives of a wooded area called Plantation Point near Arca-Butler Lake in Mississippi. It was 45 minutes from Memphis. She said Rimmer liked to go there. Detectives headed to Plantation Point. They combed the area on foot, but didn't find anything. Then they called in blackwater divers from the Shelby County Search and Rescue Unit. Specially trained to operate by touch in dark, murky black water, the divers searched the lake. They didn't find anything either. Detectives were thoroughly frustrated. They chased down every witness and lead, but were no closer to solving the case or finding Ricky Ellsworth or Michael Rimmer. Now they'd run out of options. In Memphis, nearly a month had passed with no progress in the potential homicide case. In early March, detectives got a phone call from Johnson County, Indiana. A sheriff's deputy there had stopped a maroon car for speeding. When he ran a check on the license plate, he discovered the car was stolen and there was a warrant for the driver. Michael Rimmer, sought for crimes including robbery and possible murder, had been arrested during a routine traffic stop. Detectives flew to Indiana, prepared to finally question Rimmer and examine the car for evidence. After obtaining a warrant, forensic investigators with the Johnson County Crime Unit searched the car. They hoped for solid evidence, but never expected to find what they did.
Numerous receipts, hotel receipts, pawn shop receipts, restaurant receipts, showing Mike's every step from the day Ricky came up missing till his actual apprehension.
Investigators tested the stained back seat for human blood. Results were positive. It was their first physical evidence to suggest a connection between Rimmer and the crime. Memphis detectives questioned Michael Rimmer over the next 2 days. He denied stealing the car or having anything to do with Ricky's disappearance. So far, all their evidence was circumstantial. Without Ricky's body, there was only one way to link Rimmer to her murder.
The blood from the rear of the vehicle Michael Rimmer was occupying and the blood from the scene matched. We had a problem though. We had to determine or show somehow that that blood was Ricky Ellsworth's blood.
They had one chance, a reverse paternity DNA test which uses the combined DNA traits passed on from parents to determine the DNA characteristics of their children. Forensic scientists compared blood from Ricky's mother to samples from the crime scene and the maroon car. They matched. The test established a 16 million to 1 probability that blood from the car and motel came from an offspring of Ricky's mother. It was the final link police needed to prove murder. Michael Rimmer's guilt was written in blood. Based on evidence, police believe they know what happened on February 8th. Michael Rimmer drove to the motel sometime around 1:30 a.m., knowing Ricky Ellsworth would be alone. When he arrived, she let him into the office. There, Rimmer exploded into violence, attacking her, then wrapping her body in sheets. Afterward, he tried to clean the room, but gave up and left the sink running. Dragging Ricky to his car, Rimmer made his escape. Although her body was never found, police believe Ricky Ellsworth is buried somewhere near Arca Butler Lake. Michael Rimmer was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. While no body was ever found in the Rimmer case, police used blood evidence to prove murder. But in Cleveland, Ohio, police would have to build a case on even less. On Saturday, December 15, 1984, Cleveland police were called to the home of Ernestine Campbell. She reported that her brother, Henry, was missing, and she feared for his life because she'd heard he'd been shot and his body hidden in an alley. She told police she'd last seen Henry the night before when he'd left home for a nearby after-hour spot. Officers searched the alley, but didn't find a body. In fact, they didn't find any signs of foul play. They drove through the neighborhood, but didn't see anything unusual. There was no sign of Henry Campbell, and nothing to indicate a violent crime had occurred. Officers canvassed the area, talking to residents who might have seen or heard something the night before. One witness claimed she heard shots and saw men running near the club. Another recalled hearing shots, but couldn't provide any other details. Still others confirmed shots were fired, but nobody admitted seeing anything. Police were frustrated. They had reports of gunfire and a murder, but couldn't find the purported victim. Homicide Detective John Qualey, the lead investigator, recalls the odd circumstances of the case.
Well, usually we're called to the scene of a homicide where we have a victim laying on the street or in a house, but we have a victim. And a lot of times we'll be able to get the weapon used in a crime. With this incident, a murder was reported, we went to the scene, we didn't have a body. We couldn't find the body, we couldn't find any evidence of blood, or we didn't have a weapon. It was kind of starting without anything to work with.
Police needed more information, so they returned to the Campbell house. Ernestine gave them a picture of Henry and more details. She'd heard that some people claimed they'd seen Clarence Barnes shoot her brother in the back. She said Barnes ran the after-hours club in his home and that there was bad blood between him and Henry.
Hi, Miss Richardson. Sorry.
At the station, people who had been at the club that night began coming forward. A woman named Jacqueline Richardson told investigators she saw Campbell at the club and that he argued with Barnes.
Now, you understand? Not me now. Yeah, it has to be that way. Out of here now.
When Campbell left, Barnes, who had a gun, followed him outside.
Get off me, man. I told you to stay out of my...
She said the two men were joined by a third and walked out of her sight. Shortly after that, a woman ran into the club, screaming that there'd been a shooting and Henry Campbell was injured.
The other first two, or was it
Richardson went outside, where a passerby told her some men were chasing and shooting at another.
all three?
She said she didn't see anything and returned to the club.
With the gun?
Yes, he was.
Barnes was already there, asking everyone to leave.
Okay, Mr. Santiago.
As the search continued for evidence of murder, Victor Santiago told police
With
what
those
he
people
knew.
that night?
No.
He was the third man Jacqueline Richardson had described, and his account took up where hers left off.
Give me your home. You don't care. If you don't care, I don't care who your boys are.
He said he'd seen the two men arguing outside the club and heard Barnes order Campbell to leave. According to Santiago, Campbell caught up with him a few moments later. As they walked down the street, he heard a shot and Campbell fell forward. Santiago said he took cover, then watched Barnes fire 3 more shots at the prostrate Campbell. Police now had 2 eyewitness accounts, but still no evidence of a homicide. Henry Campbell had disappeared, and detectives had 2 eyewitness accounts of murder, but no body and no evidence. Several residents claimed Clarence Barnes bragged that he'd burned Campbell's body and that nobody would ever find him.
Ask a few questions.
Investigators brought Barnes to the station for questioning.
Let's take the chair on your left.
He admitted having words with Campbell and asking him to leave, but said he didn't know what happened after that. He denied having anything to do with Campbell's disappearance. When police asked Barnes what he did for a living, he told them he worked at the Animal Resource Center at a local university. That immediately rang a bell in Qualey's mind, and he called Barnes's supervisor.
We asked him if he had an incinerator in the school. And he said, oh, yes. And we asked him how big it was. He said it was big enough to incinerate a steer. We told him then that we were investigating a homicide and that possibly there may be human remains in the incinerator, and asked him if he would seal the room. He did.
The next morning, detectives and a team of forensic investigators went to the Animal Resource Center, believing they might find the remains of Henry Campbell. While the facility director arranged access to the incinerator, the security chief showed them surveillance video from the night Campbell disappeared. It showed Barnes arriving around 3:30 a.m. He backed into the receiving area, which was approximately 15 feet from the incinerator entrance. Police could see him carrying something toward the incinerator room, but couldn't identify what it was.
The picture then jumped away and came back, and the next picture was the incinerator door open and Clarence pushing a cart in there. You could not see what was on the cart, but we knew he was in the incinerator room at that hour.
When investigators saw the incinerator, they knew they were in for a long, complicated task. Dr. Elizabeth Balraj, coroner of Cuyahoga County, recalls the challenge.
There were 100 gallons of cremated ashes containing the remains from various animals. And we had to sift through those and find a very small amount of human bones.
If human bones were to be found at all. The team began the painstaking process of sifting through the incinerator contents. Using a fine mesh screen, they collected fragments of bone and other unburned debris. Though most of the fragments were tiny and charred, some appeared to be human, including a vertebra, mandible, and part of a pelvis. They also found a piece of melted lead. Its size and mass were consistent with a .38 caliber bullet. It was the first solid evidence of murder. Although investigators believed they'd found Henry Campbell, their case would go up in smoke if they couldn't prove it. They turned to Dr. C. Owen Lovejoy, a biological anthropologist at Kent State University and an expert at identifying altered or damaged remains. He applied his skills to making a positive identification from the incomplete and severely damaged bone fragments. Lovejoy concurred with Dr. Balraj that approximately 160 of the recovered bones were human. The next step was determining whether they came from one person and whether that person was Henry Campbell. The process would be complicated by their condition.
Here, the pieces of the puzzle, all of the edges had been frayed, as you will, by the cremation process. And so none of the pieces fit together, and we had to look at them in an isolated state.
After a thorough inventory of the fragments, Lovejoy determined that portions of an entire skeleton were present. No bones were duplicated. That told Lovejoy the remains came from a single individual. But was it Henry Campbell? Next, he would try to establish specifics about the individual. Investigators had recovered part of the pelvis, which is diagnostic for both sex and age. Lovejoy concluded the remains belonged to a male, approximately Henry Campbell's age. While detectives were closer to proving they'd found Campbell, they needed positive identification. But Lovejoy couldn't give them that, not without more to go on.
Whenever we have a candidate individual that we believe the skeletal remains might match, what we do is we try to get a premortem X-ray.
Investigators delivered existing X-rays of Henry Campbell to Dr. Lovejoy. Could they help him prove murder? As Cleveland detectives sought to identify the bones found in the incinerator, Dr. Owen Lovejoy compared post-mortem X-rays and bone fragments with Campbell's radiographs. He focused on the skull, hand, and mandible. One recovered cranial fragment had a BB embedded in it. That matched an X-ray taken when Henry Campbell had accidentally been shot years earlier. Lovejoy also identified shared characteristics between Campbell's other X-rays and corresponding bone fragments. But he found the most compelling correlations in the lower mandible, or jawbone.
And the outline of that jaw, the details of the bone structure, and the details of the root areas where the teeth had been prior to death, all were configured in such a way that they indicated that this was a positive identification.
Since the jaw figured so prominently in that identification, Dr. Elizabeth Robinson, the team's forensic odontologist, reviewed Lovejoy's conclusions. In her opinion, two significant findings bolstered his analysis. The end of the jawbone was flat, a unique defect present in Henry Campbell's jaw. A second anomaly, an area of intense calcification, clinched the identification.
And it was in exactly the same area that it was on the postmortem as on the antemortem. It was also only 5 millimeters in size. In other words, it's the exact same size, same area, and on both X-rays.
With the positive identification, investigators had literally pulled proof of a homicide from the ashes. On December 21st, less than 1 week after Henry Campbell was reported missing, Barnes was officially charged with murder. Based on the evidence, police believe Barnes followed Campbell from his after-hours club, shot him, then hid his body. Later that night, Barnes took Campbell's body to the Animal Resource Center, where he incinerated it. In April of 1985, Clarence Barnes pled guilty to the murder of Henry Campbell. He received 15 years to life for aggravated murder. In Cleveland, police had to sift their case from a pile of ashes. In Maryland, investigators followed a winding trail of clues to capture a killer. Rockville, Maryland, August 10, 1988. 17-year-old Kai Lau returned early from a California vacation at the behest of a family friend to check on his mother, Lisa Tu. He hadn't heard from her in nearly a month, and others told him they hadn't heard from her either. That wasn't like his mother. When he and his mother's friend found no sign of Lisa in the house, they contacted police. They went to the Special Investigations Office at the Montgomery County Police Department to report her missing.
Great, thanks. You're welcome. Detective Turner?
Yes.
Hi.
Kai informed officers that nobody had seen or heard from his mother for a month.
Yes, the reason I called is...
He said that his stepfather, Gregory too, might know more, but he was overseas on business and Kai didn't know how to reach him. Before Gregory left, he told friends that Lisa had flown to San Francisco to visit a friend in the hospital. Kai said it was unusual for his mother to go away without telling anyone except Gregory. Police promised to investigate.
Anything look suspicious up there?
They began by contacting the airlines. Records confirmed that a one-way ticket had been purchased for LL2 on July 13th. The destination was San Francisco via a connecting flight in Los Angeles. The ticket to Los Angeles had been used, but not the one for San Francisco. It appeared Lisa, too, wasn't planning to come back. That was her right, but the detectives needed to make one more call. They contacted the friend Lisa was supposed to be visiting in San Francisco. She said she hadn't been in the hospital, wasn't expecting Lisa, and hadn't talked to her in months. Now, detectives began to consider whether Lisa, too, intended to disappear, or if there might be a more sinister explanation. Detective Roger Thompson worked the case.
It was not the normal missing person case where we know somebody's missing for a particular reason. They may not contact family members, but we sooner or later find them. This had some mystery to it.
To find out more, detectives spoke to several of Lisa's friends and learned the twos had been married nearly 10 years. It was the second marriage for both, and Kai Lau was Lisa's son from her previous marriage. The twos had enjoyed the good life. Gregory was a successful restaurateur. In fact, one of his restaurants had been a favorite of Washington's elite. But it hadn't lasted. He'd suffered business reversals and lost his restaurants. A commissioned sales job couldn't support the family's affluent lifestyle. Gregory and Lisa argued about money, and their marriage was rocky. Police also learned that Lisa was romantically involved with another man. Police questioned him at his office. He said he spoke to Lisa the afternoon of July 14th, the last day anyone saw or heard from her. He denied knowing anything about a trip to San Francisco and expressed concern over Lisa's sudden disappearance. He indicated Lisa's husband was suspicious about their relationship. When he passed a polygraph test, investigators believed he was telling the truth. Detectives checked out the family's finances and saw indications of serious problems. Gregory was $30,000 in debt. Detective Mike Turner realized too was under a lot of pressure.
Gregory was known to like to gamble, and we determined that he, through interviews with friends, had accrued some debt in gambling that he had not been able to pay. And this was another problem that arose with his relationship with Lisa.
Detectives also learned Lisa Too's bank and charge accounts had been inactive since early July. That didn't make sense if she was alive. They discovered that her husband, who was still unreachable on a business trip, would collect a $200,000 life insurance policy if anything happened to his wife. Detectives began to suspect that the couple's financial woes might spell more than a simple missing persons case. As the investigation continued, Lisa's son was doing a little detective work of his own. Kai Lau found his mother's address book in her bedroom. That was odd because she seldom went anywhere without it. He also noticed that furniture in the house was missing or rearranged. he called Detective Turner.
Hi, Detective Turner.
Kai returned to the police station and met with investigators.
Look, I've also got this withdrawal.
He had found that $44,000 had been withdrawn from a bank account Lisa kept for his education.
Yeah, almost enough for a college tuition.
And that wasn't all.
Like I said, the money.
Kai told police his stepfather's gun was missing and a sleep sofa had disappeared. He said his mother often slept on it when she and Gregory weren't getting along. Kai also informed detectives that his stepfather, Gregory, was due back from his business trip that evening. By now, investigators had a lot of questions for Gregory, too. They met him at the airport and brought him to the police station.
Officer, you have a seat right here.
He was concerned about his wife and was eager to help police. He told them he bought Lisa a plane ticket to San Francisco so she could visit a friend in the hospital. He said he drove her to Dulles International Airport the next day and watched her board the plane.
You wouldn't lie to us, would you, Mr. Two?
Absolutely not.
He claimed she called from Los Angeles and said she was awaiting the flight to San Francisco. He hadn't heard from her since. When they told him Lisa's friend wasn't sick and wasn't expecting her, he seemed surprised.
That's what Lisa told me. Well,
Then he offered another explanation. He claimed his wife was unhappy with her appearance and wanted plastic surgery. He said they'd argued about it in the past. He surmised that might have been the real reason for the trip. Lisa probably made up the story of a sick friend, realizing he wouldn't buy the ticket if he'd known the truth. When detectives inquired about the missing sofa, Two said it was infested with mice and he had it hauled away. He also said he threw the gun away after a well-publicized local incident where a homeowner shot some trespassers. He explained away the $30,000 debt as business and travel expenses. Two begged off further questions, saying he was tired from his long trip. Detectives agreed to continue the interview another day if Two would take a polygraph test. He agreed and promised to return the following Monday.
Sure, you're pretty good.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Gregory, too, didn't keep his appointment. He skipped town. To detectives, that seemed the act of a guilty man.
We then felt that the suspicions that the family had, that we had put together since the initiation of the investigation, now had come to fruition, and we were looking probably at a homicide.
Their suspicions about Gregory, too, grew even more when Kai brought them an Air Express letter from California. In it, Gregory claimed he was in Los Angeles looking for Lisa. If he didn't find her there, he planned to continue his search in San Francisco. Investigators considered the letter a self-serving excuse from a guilty man. But believing and proving are two different things. Without Lisa's body, there was no evidence she was dead. They began looking for proof in Gregory's story. Investigators followed up on Kai's tip about his missing college money and enlisted the help of the state's attorney's office. John McCarthy, deputy state attorney in Montgomery County, found Lisa had controlled it.
Gregory, too, cleaned out that account. We got bank photographs from the bank, and clear as day, you could see Gregory, too, stealing the $44,000 from that fund. And within a period of 10 days after he stole it, he had run through that money. It was gone.
Detective Turner re-examined the airline ticket to San Francisco. They learned it was possible for someone to check in, have the ticket marked, but not board the plane. He suspected Gregory, too, had done that, and that Lisa never boarded the plane. They contacted passengers who'd been on the flight. Then, Attorney McCarthy got a real break. A woman called to say she'd been on the plane with her husband and small child. While airborne, the couple took several photographs.
She says, well, I've got some pictures of the seat that Lisa 2 was supposed to be in on that plane from Washington to San Francisco, and she's not in those pictures. And she forwarded me those pictures, and one of the ways we were able to prove conclusively that Lisa was not on that plane that Gregory said she was on was with those pictures.
Detectives wanted to know more about the missing sofa sleeper. They wondered if Lisa's body was inside it when it was hauled away. They tracked down the men who picked it up. They remembered the couch because Gregory tipped them for carrying it out to the truck. They didn't notice anything unusual about it. Investigators traced it to the landfill, but that was a dead end. The sofa had already been ground up and buried. Detectives reasoned that Gregory might have gotten rid of the sofa because it contained proof of Lisa's death. If that were true, there could be other evidence at the residence. They obtained a search warrant to find out. An examination of Gregory's car uncovered incriminating evidence. Clumps of mud, weeds, and twigs were stuck in the undercarriage, indicating the car had been driven off-road. In the trunk, they found a plastic tarp, a carving knife, and a machete.
Mike, come over here. Look.
All of the items were clean, but they could have been used to dispose of a body. Inside the house, detectives found their first physical evidence of foul play. There were droplets of blood on a chair near the spot where the sofa had stood. But investigators suspected more might have been cleaned up. To find out, they processed the area with a Luma light, which makes blood that cannot be seen with the naked eye glow. They discovered blood spatters where the sofa had been, and it displayed a significant pattern.
We know that the couch was open at the time when this all occurred because there was no blood, swiping, or markings underneath the couch. It was a fold-away, opened-up couch, and when they put out the processing, you could see, basically see the outline of the couch opened up as a bed.
Investigators also found signs of smearing, evidence someone had tried to clean up the blood. While they were processing the scene, the phone rang. A car rental agency in Las Vegas was calling for Gregory 2.
Yes.
The car he rented several days before was overdue. It was the brake police were looking for. Now they finally knew where 2 was, but they needed some help in capturing him.
What I would like you to do is, if he calls in about the car in the next few days, or brings the car in, try to stall him, or if he calls in, tell him that you would like to replace the car with another car because this one needs service or whatever reason you can think of, or it's going to be resold, but somehow get him to come to the rental office to get another car.
Hello, my name's Greg.
The plan worked.
Yes, mister, we have an upgrade for you. Just a minute, please.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
On Saturday, September 10th, he arrived at the car rental office.
Yes, your car is ready.
It is?
Police arrested him on a fugitive warrant, nearly a month after he disappeared. Detectives Turner and Thompson flew to Las Vegas, where they began retracing 2's activities since he fled Maryland. A matchbook in his hotel room led them to a Chinese restaurant. The manager recognized 2 from a photograph. She told investigators he had applied for a job, saying his wife was dead and he wanted to start a new life. On the job application, he gave his name as Greg Sen. When the detectives returned home with 2, they called in a document examiner at the Maryland State Police Crime Lab. They knew Gregory had used aliases. They wanted to confirm whether the handwriting on the job application and other items he wrote matched the bank slip closing Kai Lau's college account. The stolen money would provide the motive for the more serious crime of suspected homicide. After providing known samples of Tu's writing, detectives awaited the results of the document examination. The job application, bank slip, and other documents were compared against Tu's handwriting. In making the comparison, factors such as writing style, speed, and pressure are all studied. Document examiner David Sexton explains.
And it's a combination of those characteristics as well as a combination of recognizable letter formations and that combination of characteristics that are unique to the individual's handwriting.
The writing on the job application, bank slip, and other documents was Gregory Tu's.
Fine, how are you?
Police also consulted a forensic serology investigator about the blood spatters found at the Tu house. He confirmed they were consistent with a high-velocity wound, most likely from a gunshot. Despite all the evidence investigators had collected, their case was still flawed. They needed something solid to prove murder. Without Lisa's body, the only physical evidence they had was blood from the house.
In a divorce settlement.
They had to somehow tie it to the victim.
Kathy, Karen, and Linda, and
they had only one chance, and it was a long shot. To prove Lisa Tu had been murdered, Maryland investigators had to link her to the blood in the house. They hoped forensic DNA analysis could do that, but in 1988, it was still in its infancy. In fact, DNA evidence had only been used in a few trials nationally, none of them murder cases. And the Tu case posed a significant challenge. There were no known samples of Lisa Tu's DNA that could be used for comparison. Without them, it would be difficult to connect Lisa with the blood spatter. The DNA lab needed to perform a reverse paternity test, but this time they would have to work backward. They would determine Lisa's DNA from the blood of her son. Because Kai Lau was a genetic combination of both his parents, scientists could, in theory, forensically subtract his father's DNA from his blood. What remained would be Lisa's DNA profile. Blood was drawn from Kai Lau and from his father in Hong Kong for comparison. By process of elimination, the lab confirmed with 98 to 99% accuracy that blood found at the Tu house was Lisa's. With forensic DNA testing, detectives were able to prove homicide. Investigators believe Gregory Tu was moved to murder by jealousy over his wife's affair and the prospect of solving his financial problems with her life insurance. They pieced together a likely scenario for the night of July 14th. There were indications that the couple had argued, perhaps over the affair, perhaps about money. Desperate and enraged, Gregory Tu pulled his gun from the cabinet and shot Lisa. He then disposed of her body. Despite his protestations of innocence, Gregory Tu was convicted of first-degree murder on November 21st, 1989. He is currently serving a life sentence. Lisa Tu's body has never been found. Once, police had no chance of proving murder without a body. But today, they can make a case on forensic science, even when the victim has disappeared without a trace. In 1963, detectives investigated the murder of a woman in California. But it would take technology almost 30 years to catch up with the killer. A trash bag is the only clue detectives have to the identity of a serial killer. So far, their search has met only with failure. But a new fingerprint technology will give them one last chance to put the killer away. In a murder investigation in Vermont, police have their suspect. Now all they need is solid evidence to convict him. The case hinges on a bloody but distorted palm print on the murder weapon. In cases that look all but hopeless, science finds a solution in the telltale marks of the killer's death grip. In 1985, a serial killer was on the loose in San Diego, California. The killer targeted prostitutes and other women. He'd rape and murder them, then discard their bodies in trash dumpsters. To catch him, police needed to identify his fingerprints, which proved to be elusive. On the morning of May 9, 1986, police responded to a call from a woman who came upon a ghastly sight as she was taking out her garbage, the killer's latest victim. When they arrived, they saw a sight that had become all too familiar, a body in a dumpster. This time, the murderer had wrapped it in 2 garbage bags joined with masking tape. After disposing of the body in the dumpster, he covered it with a blanket. Police questioned neighbors to find out if they'd seen anyone suspicious. No one had seen anything out of the ordinary. Homicide detectives came to the scene to investigate. An emergency unit arrived to retrieve the body. The victim was identified as Joanne Sweets, a prostitute. She had been raped and strangled to death, and several of her ribs were broken. That was the serial killer's calling card. Would the killer elude police again? It was going to be a tough case to crack. Since most of the victims were prostitutes, the murders weren't always reported, or the few eyewitnesses were unreliable. But this time, the detectives were able to lift a fingerprint from the dumpster. Detective Dan Hatfield was part of a task force formed to stop the horrid wave of killings before it went any further.
Primarily, the whole focus of the task force was to look into women, primarily prostitutes, that had been found murdered here in the city of San Diego and also in the county. There was approximately 35 to 40 unsolved cases.
The Joanne Sweets case was the latest. With any luck, it would be the last. Detectives believe the killer lived or worked in the neighborhood. 2 other prostitutes' bodies had also been discovered in dumpsters nearby.
We had Tara Simpson that was found in another dumpster that's adjacent to the Joanne Sweets case. The dumpster was located at the T of the alley. The early morning hours, the police were called here. They found the garbage container fully engulfed. Fire department finds that there's a female in there and she is badly burned. A lot of the evidence was lost because of the fact that she was badly burned. Several months after Tara Simpson's body was found here, we go up several blocks up the same alleyway. At another dumpster was found the body of Trina Carpenter. Trina Carpenter had also been manually strangled. She was wrapped in a green duffel bag at that time.
Hatfield was sure the same man was behind the deaths of all the women. But the investigation turned up no suspects. A manual search of fingerprints in police files failed to match the print found on the dumpster where Sweet's body was found. Whoever left the print didn't have a criminal record. The case went unsolved. 3 years later, fingerprint expert Diane Donnelly joined the task force to work on the Joanne Sweets case.
I was brought in on this case in 1989 at the request of Homicide, and this is one of the cases that they had asked to go back and re-examine some of the evidence to see if there was anything else we could do at this point.
She learned that fingerprint experts had already tried using a chemical called gentian violet to lift prints from the masking tape that held the garbage bags around the body. The process can expose fingerprints left on sticky surfaces. When a finger touches the adhesive side of tape and is removed, skin cells remain behind. The gentian violet stains those cells, revealing the print. Experts repeated the process over and over, but couldn't raise a single print. Then, shortly after Donnelly joined the task force, she and San Diego detectives received a break. They decided to make another attempt to identify the print from the dumpster using a new computerized fingerprint matching system. Several suspects were considered and dismissed before a match was made. The prints belonged to a man named Brian Maurice Jones. At the time of the San Diego murders, he'd never been arrested. Since then, Jones had been convicted for rape, robbery, and kidnapping a prostitute. He became the prime suspect in the murder of Joanne Sweets. But detectives knew the print from the dumpster wasn't enough to make a case. Jones would have an alibi. His mother lived in a building adjacent to the alley where Sweet's body had been found.
And of course you could logically assume that his defense would be that he had taken out his mother's trash. So we needed something more concrete, that proverbial nail in the coffin, to link him to this murder and maybe some of the other murders of the women in San Diego.
Even without a print, Dan Hatfield had a strong hunch that Jones had murdered Joanne Sweets and the others. According to Hatfield's scenario, Jones most likely cruised the boulevard looking for victims. He'd pick a prostitute and take her to his mother's apartment while she was at work. He'd act like a typical client, but the evening would culminate in murder. Afterward, he'd wrap the body up and take it out to the dumpster, like he was taking out the trash. Jones was still in prison for lesser crimes, but he'd be eligible for parole in 10 years. If Hatfield could link him to the Joanne Sweets murder, he'd make sure Jones would never get out.
I believe when Mr. Jones dumped Joanne Sweets' body in the dumpster, he probably felt he could get away with it since he got away with the other two murders.
In their effort to prove Jones's guilt, the detectives would pin their hopes on the latest method of fingerprint technology. Stalled for 3 years, the murder investigation of Joanne Sweets got a jump start in 1992. Detectives once again focused on the garbage bags the killer used to wrap his victim. 6 years earlier, no prints were found on the bags. But Dan Hatfield and Diane Donnelly were sure the prints were there.
At the time that I was investigating these cases, it was my feeling that there were in fact latent prints on the garbage bags. We were just not using the right technique. I checked around, I talked with the FBI. What they told me is that there was a technique that was being used in England and also in Canada with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, a technique called vacuum metal deposition. At which point I called Canada. I found out that they were in fact using this technique to lift latent prints from plastics, and that they were more than happy to do our case.
Donnelly took the evidence to the laboratories of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Ottawa. She was hopeful, but the prints were 6 years old. Would they have degraded too much for the process to work?
They were more than willing and happy to assist me in this matter, but they were not too optimistic about obtaining any identifiable latent prints.
The process, known as vacuum metal deposition, was developed in the U.S., but most jurisdictions don't have the money to utilize it. It's used more widely in Europe and Canada. Its main application is on plastics. But for fingerprint expert Pat Laturnis of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, it's a versatile process that works when all other techniques have failed.
It's possible to get fingerprints on things like magazine paper, paper towel, tissue, very fine exhibits. It has a limited application in some of those things, but really, when there's no other way to do it, and it works. If we take the best exhibit, solid plastic type of exhibits, it's a matter of keeping that clean and then placing it inside the work holder of the chamber.
Handling the evidence carefully, Laturnis places it in the chamber. A few milligrams of gold are deposited on a heating element. Once the chamber is sealed, pumps create a vacuum.
Once it's within a vacuum, the gold source is heated, and that heat is melting the metal. The metal would almost liquefy, boil, and then you can compare it to steam where it would go straight up and condense on the surface that it hits.
A thin, invisible layer coats the plastic surface of the garbage bag. If the bag contains no fingerprints, the layer of gold will be uniform. But if fingerprints are present, the gold will sink into them, leaving the oily ridges of the print uncoated. The process is then repeated with a few milligrams of zinc. Like the gold, the zinc vaporizes within the evidence chamber. It will recondense only onto other metals, so it will only cling to the previous layer of gold. But the zinc won't stick on the oily residue of the fingerprint where there's no gold. The result is a high-contrast fingerprint. The bags were removed from the chamber and inspected. This moment would make or break the case against Jones. After 6 years in hiding, the prints on the bags finally became visible. And with them, a dead-end case cleared a major roadblock.
We knew this exhibit was 6 years old. We knew it was involved in a homicide, which made it a high-profile case. And it was quite exciting to see the latent when we pulled it out of the chamber.
The latent prints found on the garbage bags matched the prints of Brian Maurice Jones. The vacuum metal deposition process enabled Hatfield and Donnelly to connect him to the murder.
The nail in the casket were in fact the latent prints that were taken from the garbage bags, and that came back matching Brian Jones without a doubt. There was no way for him to disprove the fact that these were somebody else's prints. That was a nail in the coffin, as far as I'm concerned.
In 1996, the state of California tried Brian Maurice Jones for the murder of Joanne Sweets and several related crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Advances in the science of fingerprint detection had solved a case that seemed all but hopeless.
I feel very good about it, the fact that even though these victims were prostitutes, they were people also. And I think with his conviction, I believe that they had their day in court, and justice was served.
The vacuum deposition process raised Brian Jones's fingerprints and secured his conviction. But it was a computer that first singled him out. In another California case, detectives used computer technology to pursue a killer across 3 decades. On October 2nd, 1963, Thora Rose was spending a quiet evening alone in her apartment in Hollywood, California. She had rented the apartment just a month earlier after separating from her husband and was slowly adjusting to life on her own. Rose worked as a waitress and kept mainly to herself in her free time. The ground floor apartment was considered to be in a safe neighborhood, even for a woman who lived alone. But that night, someone invaded that safety, and Thora Rose became his target. He waited in the darkness as she settled in for the evening. When her lights went out, he made his move. As Rose drifted off to sleep, he pried open a window over the kitchen sink and crawled into her apartment. Once inside, he slipped through the kitchen and crept toward the bedroom. When he got there, he attacked. After a violent struggle, Thora Rose, age 43, was dead. When Rose failed to come to work the next day, her employer telephoned her, but got no response. Concerned, he called the police. When they arrived, they found Thora Rose's body in the bedroom. Police questioned neighbors, but no one had seen anyone enter or leave Rose's apartment. Nobody heard a thing. It was one of the worst crimes the quiet Hollywood neighborhood had ever experienced. Almost 35 years later, Los Angeles police detective Mike McDonough visits the scene of the crime.
Hollywood back then was a completely different place as it is today. I mean, when you think Hollywood back in '63, it was still the movie industry, still a lot of single-family residences here, a couple of apartment buildings, completely different world. The crime rate was practically nothing to compare to what it is to today. Hollywood now, we're averaging anywhere from 50 to 60 homicides a year. Back in 1963, they had 4.
The murder caused a major stir. The Homicide Division of the Los Angeles Police Department gave the case top priority. At first, just 2 detectives were assigned to the case, but the number quickly rose to 6. Eventually, 32 uniformed officers and 2 sergeants joined the investigation. They canvassed the neighborhood for a suspect. Inside the apartment, experts dusted for fingerprints.
There was palm prints and fingerprints inside the kitchen and throughout the house. There's approximately 27 fingerprints that were lifted inside the residence, leading from the front window here into the bedroom.
The police officers working the neighborhood found nothing. It was up to the fingerprint experts alone to solve the case. With the long trail of fingerprints left behind, the detectives were certain they would catch the murderer. Their confidence was well-founded. For more than 100 years, fingerprinting has proven to be one of the most effective ways to pin criminals to crimes. The science goes back to 1880, when Scottish physician Henry Falls suggested that ridge patterns on the fingers and hands could be useful in identifying criminals. In 1901, Scotland Yard adopted the idea, and the rest of the world soon followed. Fingerprinting works for two reasons. First, no two people share print patterns. And second, a person's fingerprints remain unchanged throughout life. The skin of human fingers and hands have raised patterns called friction ridges, which help us grip objects more firmly. They're constantly coated with a film of perspiration from tiny pores. The curves, loops, and other characteristics of the ridges can occur in billions of combinations. At a crime scene, the perpetrator may leave noticeable prints if he touched blood, grease, or another dark substance. If he touched something soft, like putty, the fingerprints may be impressed on its surface. But the majority of fingerprints are invisible, known as latent fingerprints. They're made of about 98% perspiration and 2% body oil. We leave them on virtually everything we touch. Like film in a camera, they must be developed to be seen. The fingerprint experts at Los Angeles Police Department's fingerprint lab have long relied on powders to make latent prints visible. It's been one of the most common and effective methods since fingerprinting began. When lightly applied with a camel hair brush, powder adheres to the moisture in the fingerprint, providing a finely detailed image. The detective then lifts the print using a strip of clear tape and places it on a card with his initials, the time, date, and location of the print. This detailed information is vital if the print will be used as evidence in court. After the fingerprint experts working on the Thora Rose case lifted the finger and palm prints from her Hollywood apartment, they had to prove they belonged to the perpetrator. There's always a possibility they could belong to someone else. Detectives obtained what are called elimination prints from everyone who had contact with Thora Rose.
They were able to contact those people, the restaurants, places she worked. They fingerprinted everyone that was there. They also went as far as local delivery boys, as far as delivering chicken, mail people, newspaper people, anyone that had any contact with this place, they checked out.
After all other persons were eliminated, detectives drew the only possible conclusion: the prints belonged to the killer. Now they could be sent to the lab to be compared by fingerprint examiners to prints of criminals in their files. Whenever police make an arrest for even the smallest infraction, they require the arrested person to be fingerprinted. The prints are kept on file and, in some cases, sent to other police jurisdictions. If the suspect is ever involved in another crime, his prints will be available for comparison. The traditional way of recording fingerprints is the ink and roll method. Each finger is rolled on an ink pad, then impressed on a card with the arrested person's name and personal data. The document is then added to the fingerprint files. Recently, some jurisdictions have begun scanning fingerprints into a computer. The scanner creates a digital image of the prints so they can be added to the database. A beam of light replaces the ink pad. Either way, the matching process begins when the examiner compares prints from the crime scene with prints from police files. Comparing fingerprints is much the same today as in 1963. The examiner must look for matching points of identification. The friction ridges arrange themselves into arches, loops, and whorls. Sometimes they end abruptly. Sometimes they split in two. The examiner considers all these patterns when making an identification. If enough of them match, then he can be certain he's looking at the prints of the same person. In the Thora Rose case, Los Angeles detectives reviewed all the fingerprints in their files. When none matched, they sent a detective to the state capitol in Sacramento to expand the search statewide. He scoured every file, looking at a staggering 30,000 fingerprints. The labor took months, but still nothing matched.
I mean, it's a point that they put in an unbelievable man-hours of time on this case, and even with all that they have done, which is probably thousands and thousands of % more than what we could do today with our crimes, they still weren't able to come up with anything.
Even though the killer had left behind many fingerprints, the detectives couldn't match them to anyone with a police record. The case was unsolved. The files were shelved, and the murderer of Thora Rose went free. 30 years would pass before time and technology would flush him out. 3 decades after the murder of Thora Rose, a new computerized system of fingerprint comparison went online. The Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or AFIS, promised to revolutionize the field of fingerprint identification. It matches prints in a fraction of the time it took using the old method. Fingerprint examiner Donald Keir was one of the first at the Los Angeles Police Department to put AFIS to use.
This fingerprint system takes time to get used to. It was new. It takes time to utilize it, and we had a lot of crimes to solve.
Keir and his colleagues first used AFIS to match prints collected from current crimes against those in AFIS's files. Then they tried an experiment to see if the system could solve old cases by matching previously unmatched prints. They chose 50 old homicide cases to test. Could AFIS breathe new life into dead cases? To find out, Keir went to the archives in the basement of the police department. There, under the dust of 30 years or more, stood shelves brimming with old fingerprint files. They were gathered from all manner of crimes, some solved, some not. One of the files he pulled contained prints from the Thora Rose murder. It was the oldest case selected. The chance of finding a suspect after almost 30 years seemed remote. But with millions of prints added to police files since 1963, and the ability of the AFIS system to compare them at lightning speed, detectives had a glimmer of hope. But first, the prints from the Rose case had to be prepared. Before AFIS can recognize any fingerprint, an examiner must photograph it at 5 times its normal size. In contrast to prints taken from a suspect at the police station, the ridges and patterns of most prints from a crime scene are faint and indistinct. The examiner must carefully enhance the pattern on tracing paper. Otherwise, the computer's scanner will be unable to read it.
Any place where I'm looping it off is where a ridge in the fingerprint pattern ends. And we want to make sure those are really clear because that's what the computer uses for a search. They're called minutia or characteristics. I check it frequently to see if I'm missing anything, go back over what I've been doing here.
Where the latent print is unreadable, The examiner must hazard a guess as to line and detail. The tracing is scanned into the computer. The examiner cleans up any indistinct lines on the screen and identifies notable characteristics of the latent print. The computer will use these as a frame of reference. APHIS then begins the matching process. The computer looks at several areas of the unknown print. It then compares these points against prints in its database. It ranks each print according to how closely it matches the unknown print. In another room, the massive APHIS mainframe searches through millions of digitized fingerprints looking for a match. In less than an hour, it completes a job that would ordinarily take months. Then, the system delivers the closest matches. But it's up to the examiner to make the final match by eye. The prints identified by APHIS are compared side by side with the suspect's print.
There can be a lot of things that match, but if there's something that you know is pretty obviously a real minutia point, like this one was a pretty big one right here, a little short line, and it looks like that might be it there, but over next to it was a place where another ridge ended. There's nothing like that over here, so I would probably disregard that one.
The APHIS system has had remarkable results. During its first year of operation, San Francisco police were able to clear 816 unsolved cases, including 52 homicides. Los Angeles police hoped for similar success with their unsolved cases. They weren't disappointed. Soon after they entered the fingerprints from the Thora Rose case, APHIS made a hit. The computer produced 3 suspects, among them a man named Vernon Robinson. In 1963, Robinson hadn't been arrested, so his fingerprints weren't on file. But he'd been arrested a number of times since then, so his prints were part of police records. Detectives using APHIS fingered him as a suspect. Detective Mike McDonough headed the new investigation.
My main concern was to see if Mr. Robinson should have been there or not. I wanted to make sure that he wasn't one of the detectives or a police officer at the scene, he wasn't a paramedic, or that he wasn't for some reason a friend of Miss Robinson's, that fingerprints just happened to be there.
When all other possibilities were eliminated, McDonough concluded that Robinson was the likely killer of Thora Rose.
With that, our fingerprint people obtained the additional fingerprints, started hand searching them, physically checking the fingerprints from the crime scene against Mr. Robinson's prints, and every one is coming right back to Mr. Robinson. I mean, at this point, there was no doubt about it.
Los Angeles police tracked Robinson to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he was now a family man with a management job in a maintenance company. He denied committing the crime, insisting that at the time of the murder, he was in San Diego at the naval base where he was stationed. But naval records indicated Robinson had completed his training by the date of the murder. His alibi was without support.
What would sway the jury was, I mean, the fingerprints are there. You cannot deny that. I mean, we're not talking 1 or 2 fingerprints. We're talking 20-some fingerprints. We're talking them at the point of entry through the entire house and right up to where the victim was discovered.
After killing Thora Rose, Vernon Robinson managed to evade capture for almost 30 years. His life had changed, but his fingerprints remained the same. After they were matched with those from the crime scene, Robinson was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. APHIS, a phenomenal breakthrough in criminal identification, had finally obtained justice for Thora Rose. Though APHIS has dramatically improved the chances of matching fingerprints to criminals, it's useless without clear prints to work from. But crime scenes are often messy, and criminals don't always leave their prints in convenient spots. In a case in Vermont, a murder investigation hinged on two fragile and ill-placed prints, and one investigator's attempt to read them. On Memorial Day, 1992, Glenn Michelson had a party. He and his friends were putting the cold Vermont winter behind them and kicking off the beginning of summer. But the celebration was nearly ruined by an uninvited guest. As the party was winding down, he tried to make off in Michelson's car with one of the kegs of beer. But three of Michelson's buddies caught him in the act. They chased him off the property and retrieved the keg. With the commotion over and the keg emptied, the three men decided to continue celebrating at a nearby tavern. Michelson stayed home. The group returned to the house 45 minutes later, still in high spirits. At first, they didn't notice their host was nowhere in sight. When they called out to him, he didn't answer. They assumed he went to bed. It wasn't until one of the men noticed something peculiar in another room that the horrible truth revealed itself. A ski pole that appeared to be sticking out of the floor was actually embedded in Michelson's skull. They called the Vermont State Police, who rushed to the scene. Michelson's friends couldn't believe the friend they'd laughed with a few hours ago now lay dead. While the police made their report, detectives scoured the house for clues. Their inspection of the brutal crime scene revealed a bloody knife in the kitchen sink. It looked like the victim had been stabbed several times before the ski pole was repeatedly jabbed into his skull. According to Sergeant Miles Heffernan, the victim didn't die easily.
He was obviously involved in a struggle, had a lot of blood on his clothes. There was a lot of blood on the walls in the hallway.
When questioned, the three men who found the body told the detectives about the person who tried to steal Michelson's car and the beer keg. His name was Robert Plant. He'd tagged along with one of the invited guests and grew surly as the evening progressed. The men recalled he wore white shoes with pink laces, the same shoes that were found near the barefoot corpse. The cowboy boots that Michelson had worn were missing. As police continued to investigate, a call came through about a car that had run off the road less than a mile away. A neighbor named Robert Salzman made the report.
Mr. Salzman was in the living room with his wife and child and heard the car go off the road. He came out and observed Robert Plant walking from the vehicle to the front porch of Mr. Salzman's residence. He had a discussion with Robert Plant. Initially, Plant seemed pleasant. He asked if he could get a wrecker, and Mr. Salzman was agreeable.
But then, Plant became aggressive and broke a window. Salzman threw him off his property and called the police. They arrived within minutes and found the car on the side of the road. It matched the description of Glenn Michelson's vehicle, but Plant was nowhere in sight. Apparently, he fled on foot. Police searched the woods and found him in a short time, passed out under a tree. On his feet were Michelson's cowboy boots. He was taken to the station for questioning and booked for murder. On the surface, it seemed Heffernan had an open and shut case against him. But Plant denied the crime, and the police had no eyewitnesses. Theoretically, Plant could claim he had stolen Michelson's property after someone else committed the murder. The detectives would try to bolster their circumstantial case with forensic evidence, Plant's fingerprints. They knew prints lifted from walls, sinks, and drawers had little value, since Plant had been a guest at Michelson's party. But they found bloody prints on the grip of the ski pole and on a door frame near the body. If these prints could be identified as Robert Plant's, police would clinch their case. To help him make the identification, Heffernan called on fingerprint expert John Creighton of the Vermont Department of Public Safety's Forensic Lab. Because the prints were etched in the victim's dried blood, they were extremely incriminating and extremely fragile. Traditional methods of dusting with powder would not be effective. Fortunately, Creighton has a well-stocked arsenal with the means to recover difficult prints. How a print is raised depends on the kind of surface it's on.
Basically, there's two different types of evidence that come into the lab for fingerprinting. There's porous and non-porous evidence. The porous evidence is papers and cardboards and things of that nature, and the non-porous evidence is wood, plastics, metal, glass, things of that nature. So depending on what type of evidence it is, will dictate what type of examination you do.
Paper and other porous surfaces leave no moisture for powders to cling to. One classic method for raising prints from these surfaces is iodine fuming. Iodine crystals are placed inside a glass tube. The tube is then packed with fiberglass and copper sulfate. Breath passing through the crystals heats them, creating fumes. When the fumes reach the fingerprints, the iodine reacts with fatty oils, making them visible. A drawback of this method is that the prints will disappear in about 20 minutes when the iodine evaporates. They must be photographed after fuming, so police will have a record of them. Another way to find fingerprints on paper is to spray the surface with a chemical called ninhydrin.
Ninhydrin is a spray or a compound that reacts to amino acids that are present in eccrine and sebaceous sweat deposited latent prints. The ninhydrin is sprayed onto porous material and is then catalyzed, or the reaction is catalyzed by applying heat and moisture, generally by means of an iron. This develops the prints much more quickly. Otherwise, you'd have to set them in the dark and wait anywhere from 24 to possibly 72 hours for any latent impressions to develop that way.
Because the amino acids in fingerprints take a long time to disappear, ninhydrin has been used to develop latent prints as old as 15 years. Superglue has also become a staple of fingerprint examiners. Technically called cyanoacrylate ester, it's used on non-porous surfaces, like plastic, where fragile prints could be easily brushed away when powders are applied. Superglue is often used for developing prints inside a car. The glue is poured into a small container and heated. The car is closed up tightly. As the glue is heated, its fumes adhere to the moisture in latent fingerprints and fixes them in place. The examiner can then use traditional powders without the danger of destroying the print. The Glenn Michelson case posed a different set of problems. The bloody thumbprint on the doorframe near the victim's body was barely visible and too delicate to lift. Creighton asked detectives to remove the section of doorframe bearing the print and send it to him, so he could examine it in a more controlled environment. Creighton's job was to make the print on the doorframe distinct without ruining it. He could then compare it with Robert Plant's. First, he took photographs so he would have a record of the evidence before the procedure.
Items of evidence are photographed before any physical or chemical development takes place in order to recover and preserve any existing latent detail that is present on the item. Afterwards, then we can do the various processes that are applied to developing the latent impression on that item.
Creighton sprayed the doorframe with a stain called amido black. The chemical reacts with blood, darkening the print and making it easier to identify.
The amido black is a protein stain. It stains the protein that is within the blood itself. So when the ridges or the outline of the impression on the finger is deposited in the blood, the amido black is going to make that impression darker. It allows it to have more contrast with the background.
Bloody fingerprints are very fragile in most cases, so they can't be lifted with tape without destroying them, even after they're developed with amido. Instead, Creighton photographed the enhanced print. When he compared it to Plant's, it matched. But Plant could have touched the blood-stained doorframe after someone else committed the crime. And the evidence against Plant must convince a jury of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The irrefutable evidence in the murder of Glenn Michelson had yet to be processed. Glenn Michelson had been the victim of a callous murder, a ski pole driven through his skull. Robert Plant was the prime suspect, but could detectives tie him to the crime? The answer rested on a bloody palm print left on the grip of the weapon. To identify the print, John Creighton needed to photograph it. First, he'd have to make it more visible. That was easier said than done.
The big dilemma was it was a black ski pole grip, and it was a dark reddish-brown blood impression that was deposited on that. Now what I had to do was I had to improve the contrast, either by lightening the background of the black ski pole grip or by lightening the blood impression itself.
Creighton lit the print with a polylight, a lamp that can project a wide spectrum of wavelengths. The light produced enough contrast to photograph the print. But Creighton faced a second problem. The curvature of the grip prevented the camera lens from keeping the entire print in focus.
I had to keep rotating the ski pole grip in order to come up with enough characteristics within the pattern area or within the latent impression that would give me enough information to make an identification.
By manipulating the grip, Creighton was able to get a clear photograph of the print. After it was processed, he compared the print to Plant's. It matched. Creighton had placed the murder weapon firmly in Plant's hand. The events of Glenn Michelson's final hours now made sense. Detectives believed that after being kicked off Michelson's property, Plant hid in the darkness and waited for an opportunity to sneak back into the house. Once the guests had left, he saw his chance and made his move. He slipped into the kitchen and rummaged around until he found a knife. As he stepped into the hallway, Michelson spotted him. The two men struggled, but Plant had the fatal advantage. He stabbed Michelson repeatedly until he brought the victim down. He removed Michelson's boots and put them on his own feet. Then he realized his victim wasn't dead. So he found a ski pole in another room and returned to finish him off. As he thrust the pole, he put his hand on the doorframe for support. After the final blow, he left the house, stealing Michelson's car for his getaway. But he only made it about a mile before he ran off the road. The bloody prints that Creighton analyzed gave Detective Miles Heffernan the evidence he needed to convict Robert Plant.
It was very compelling for a jury when they, hard to explain or explain away. You've got your thumbprint in the victim's blood on the door molding, and you've got the handprint on the murder weapon. It tells a story right there.
For the murder of Glenn Michelson, Robert Plant received a sentence of 50 years to life. For more than a century, fingerprints have proven themselves a reliable and irrefutable way to link criminals to their crimes. In the next century, their role will increase as scientists improve ways to recover them. More and more, killers will be delivered into the arms of justice by their own hands. A hat, a glove, a trail of blood. Investigators believed they led to a killer. The prosecution thought it had an airtight case. Hard evidence, bolstered by rigid science. The defense argued the evidence was tainted and the science was shoddy. The jury expressed reasonable doubt about the guilt of Orenthal James Simpson and serious doubts about forensics. In courts of law and the halls of science, it was the trial of the century. Los Angeles, California. A town famous for sunshine, celebrities, and scandal. But even by LA standards, the events of June 1994 were electrifying. In an affluent suburb, 2 people were found brutally murdered. The prime suspect was a football star turned film actor. All eyes focused on the Los Angeles County Courthouse as the trial unfolded like a Hollywood movie. For 10 months, the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson played out in the courtroom and on televisions around the world. On October 3rd, 1995, the world held its breath as the jury rendered its decision. It took just under 3 hours to reach its verdict.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being as charged.
The verdict was a shock to the Los Angeles County District Attorneys who tried the case and to the families of the victims. But for the defense, it was confirmation that the quality of the evidence must be weighed before depriving a person of his freedom. From the start, Simpson was also being tried in the court of public opinion. Though many applauded the verdict, others were stunned. Homicide Detective Tom Lang of the Los Angeles Police Department was one of the men in charge of overseeing the evidence collection at the crime scene.
There are people on death row. Death row. There are people that have indeed been put to death on much, much less evidence, on a tenth of that evidence.
Defense attorney Barry Scheck was a member of Simpson's dream team and one of the most vocal critics of how the evidence against O.J. Simpson was collected and processed.
The way that crime scene was handled by the criminalists from the Los Angeles Police Department, by the people in the crime lab when they did the initial DNA testing, and by the medical examiner's office was shameful.
Soon after the trial began, it became clear that more than Simpson was on trial. Forensic science would also have its day in court. Could the evidence and the methods under which it was collected withstand the defense team's harsh scrutiny? There were no eyewitnesses to the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman. But from the very beginning, the prosecution thought strong circumstantial evidence pointed to the killer. In the Brentwood section of Los Angeles, in the early morning of June 13, 1994, a dog led some neighbors to the front walk of Nicole Brown Simpson's condominium. There lay the mutilated bodies of Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman. Their killer, or killers, had slit their throats. Bloody shoe prints and drops of blood to the left of them led away from the murder scene toward a back alley. Police believed the prints belonged to someone who'd been bleeding from the left hand as he quit the scene. Also found near the bodies were a blood-soaked glove and a pullover cap. The killer had apparently left them behind. After the crime scene had been secured, the officers called the Homicide Division. Detective Lang received a call at 3 a.m. on the 13th to take charge of the investigation. He arrived at the scene around 4:25 a.m.
The first impression was that it was an overkill, probably a rage, some type of rage killing, that there was one killer.
The ground was littered with potential clues. A leather glove, a ski cap, Ronald Goldman's pager, and his car keys, a dog's footprints in the blood, and one set of size 12 shoe prints leading away from the bodies. Detectives had to determine which were important. They started with the blood.
Along with the heel-to-toe stride analysis of the bloody shoe prints, told us that the source was in fact walking. Not what you would expect after committing a brutal double murder. There's an interruption in his gait, and he stops, and there's 2 or 3 prints that point back towards where he was, indicating the possibility that the killer stopped and looked back. Now, when he did that, was he looking, say, hey, I lost my cap, I lost my glove, should I go back and get them? No, I better get out of here, it's very dark down there. So that may have been that hesitation in that stride that we saw in those bloody shoe prints.
At the request of his superior, Lang left the crime scene to notify the victim's estranged husband former football star and broadcaster O.J. Simpson that his ex-wife had been killed. He traveled the short distance to Simpson's home on North Rockingham Drive with his partner Phil Van Natter and other detectives assigned to the case. One of them named Mark Furman. It was the first time Lang and Van Natter had worked with Furman.
Mr. Simpson, this is the police. Mr. Simpson, this is the police. Will you please open the gate?
They approached the front gate of Simpson's home. Though they could see lights on in the house, no one responded to the buzzer. According to the testimony of Mark Furman at trial, he then noticed a white Ford Bronco outside the gate. It was parked at an odd angle. Through the window, he saw a small black bag bearing the label Orenthal Productions. Furman concluded the car belonged to O.J. Simpson. He then called Tom Lang over to show him something else he had found. Near the door handle on the driver's side, there appeared to be a spot of blood. Lang testified that the detectives feared Simpson was injured and decided to enter Simpson's property to investigate, even though they didn't have a warrant. Furman climbed over the 5-foot wall and let the other detectives in. Lang and Van Natter checked the front door, while Furman investigated behind the house. It didn't appear as if anyone was home. Detectives roused Cato Kalin from a bungalow at the rear of the house. Kalin, a guest of Simpson's, wasn't certain of Simpson's whereabouts, but told the detectives he'd heard several loud thumps behind his room earlier that evening. Police later learned that Simpson had left hours earlier for Chicago. While the other detectives continued their search, Furman, alone, went to investigate the cause of the strange noises Kalin reported. He found a bloody glove in plain view. It appeared to match the blood-soaked glove found at the murder scene. Furman brought Van Natter to show him his discovery. Simpson's Rockingham estate was declared the second crime scene of the night. O.J. Simpson was now a prime suspect.
He was not a suspect initially when we went on the property. But once the glove had been found, he most definitely became a suspect.
According to the testimony of Philip Van Natter, as dawn broke over Los Angeles, he was able to see drops of blood in Simpson's driveway. They led from the Bronco to Simpson's house. Later, Van Natter found drops of blood in the entrance hall. As he looked into the Bronco, he saw still more traces of blood on the console and seat. Van Natter ordered the car seized and by 10:45 obtained a warrant to search the house for additional evidence. Meanwhile, Simpson returned from Chicago. Police had notified him by phone of his ex-wife's murder. He agreed to be interviewed by Detectives Lang and Van Natter without the presence of his lawyer. The detectives noticed a deep cut on a finger of his left hand. Van Natter asked Simpson repeatedly about the injury. His responses seemed inconsistent and contradictory. First, he said he cut his finger in Chicago on a broken glass. Then he changed his story and said he may have cut it in L.A. and reopened it in Chicago. To Lang and Van Natter, Simpson's explanation seemed evasive.
left-handed, Mr. Simpson?
They began to investigate his whereabouts on the night of the murders.
So you were cutting the knife, cutting the orange then with a knife in your right hand?
Police located the limousine driver who took Simpson to Los Angeles International Airport for his flight to Chicago. He had arrived at Simpson's estate ahead of schedule at 10:25 p.m.
Mr. Simpson?
He testified he didn't see the Bronco and received no answer when he pressed the buzzer at the gate. He then drove around the block and returned shortly before 11 p.m. The driver said at that time he noticed the Bronco parked on the street and saw an African-American male walking hurriedly up the driveway into the house. Then he saw a light go on. O.J. Simpson told him over the intercom that he'd overslept and would be down in a moment. Police believed the murders took place around 10:30. The prosecution felt Simpson's alibi couldn't hold up. They now had to find a motive. To build their case, police interviewed friends and family members of Nicole Brown. They suggested the killing was the final act of a vengeful and abusive husband. Nicole, battered and bruised, had called the police in 1989, charging that Simpson had beaten her.
911 emergency. Can you get someone over here now to 325 Gretna Green? He's back. Please. Okay, what does he look like? He's O.J. Simpson. I think you know his record. Could you just send somebody over here? Okay, what is he doing there? He just drove up again. He just drove somebody over. Okay, wait a minute. What kind of car is he in? He's in a white Bronco, but first of all, he broke the back door down to get in. Okay, wait a minute. What's your name? Nicole Simpson. Okay.
For his actions, a court ordered Simpson to perform community service. More recently, friends said he'd been stalking Nicole, threatening her and pressuring her to renew their marriage. Nicole had also become concerned about a missing set of keys to her condominium. They would resurface after his arrest.
Days before she was murdered, she told her mother that they were missing and she had thought Simpson had stolen them. And we find them on his person.
Based on the evidence they had collected, the LAPD filed formal charges against Orenthal James Simpson for the double murders. He was scheduled to deliver himself into custody at 11 a.m. on June 17, 1994. When he didn't arrive at police headquarters, the LAPD went to arrest him, only to find he had fled. As they began an extensive search, a television news helicopter began broadcasting images of Simpson and his friend A.C. Cowlings driving along the freeways of Los Angeles in a white Ford Bronco. After driving back to his Rockingham mansion, Simpson surrendered to police. The circumstantial and forensic evidence appeared to confirm Simpson's guilt. The prosecution felt it now had a case that could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, the case would raise a cloud of doubt about forensic science itself. A week into the investigation of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, the LAPD turned its case over to the district attorney's office. Prosecutors, along with the LAPD's Tom Lang and Phil Van Atter, were increasingly confident their case would hold up in court.
Phil and I talk about our last 10 murders combined don't have this evidence. So unquestionably, there's more evidence than that I challenge any prosecutor to tell me they've seen more, unless you've had it in, in Yankee Stadium in front of 80,000 people. I've never seen more evidence or even heard of more evidence in a criminal case than this.
The prosecution accumulated what it felt to be a mountain of evidence. The 2 blood-stained gloves, blood found at the scene, in Simpson's Bronco, and on his clothing, as well as hair found on the knit cap consistent with that of an African-American male.
This is very important evidence. Circumstantial, yes, but extremely important evidence. What's interesting in this case is every little thing like that ended up in the lap of O.J. Simpson. Nothing was exculpatory. Nothing said someone else was involved or a second person. Nothing says this guy didn't do it.
The trial of O.J. Simpson for the murder of his ex-wife Nicole Brown and her friend Ronald Goldman began in January 1995 in the Los Angeles County Courthouse. Because California state courts allow TV cameras, an audience of millions followed the trial day after day. It was the most watched trial in history. For LAPD detective Tom Lang, this made testifying difficult.
So I'm on the stand, and after all these days, and I've got a jury glaring at me, above them is this camera with 50-some-odd million people watching me live. Am I concentrating on that camera and all these millions of people that I know are watching me, or am I concentrating on the attorney and the questions being asked of me? That's the negative impact that much publicity can have on a case. And it did play a factor here.
The prosecution would try to prove that O.J. Simpson acted alone, killing Brown and Goldman with brutal efficiency. Brown's blood was found on Goldman and vice versa. To the prosecution, this meant the same knife had been used to kill both victims. To better understand how the murders could have been committed, the prosecution sought the expertise of crime scene reconstructionist and former homicide detective Rod Englert.
So I have to just look at the evidence, let the evidence do the talking, and then find support for that evidence to work out a logical sequence. That's what a reconstructionist does.
7 weeks after the murders, Englert first walked through the crime scene in an attempt to piece together the elements of his reconstruction.
So the first thing that I did was to get a feel for the scene, the dimensions, the space, walk through Nicole's home, upstairs, downstairs, and looking, and you might find this interesting. You know what I was looking for? I don't know what I was looking for. I just know it when I see it. I know what's out of place because of that experience. Not that I'm cerebral or anything, but you just, you know, having seen these so many times, you just sort of, you recognize when something's not right.
This reconstruction is based on Englert's written report as presented to the court. It speculates how the crime may have occurred and how long it might take, assuming the prosecution's theory that O.J. Simpson was the killer. The defense contended that the murders would have involved a prolonged struggle of as much as 15 minutes. The prosecution, however, believed they took a total of 30 seconds.
The evidence suggests that when Nicole came out of her door, and we're going in slow motion, that she was approached by O.J. Simpson, who hit her on the head numerous times, and then she has 3 stab wounds to the left side of her neck that went very, very deep, and she goes down causing abrasions to her elbow, to her face from hitting the concrete. Then after she is down on the ground, then Ron Goldman walks up, and when he walks up, an altercation is between the two of them. The glove comes off because O.J. had his left arm around. The glove drops in the scene, and he incapacitates Ron Goldman and then goes back to Nicole and then picks up her hair, cuts her throat from left to right all the way back to her spine, lowers her head down, and then with the evidence that is on the knife goes back to and then cuts the throat of Ron Goldman, and then he's bleeding on the bars and then lays him over on his left side through that process. And this is a position that Goldman was in somewhat. Then he goes back to Nicole, steps on her back. There's a foot impression in this area on her back, and then leaves the scene.
Englert also came up with a theory about how the killer's glove had been left at the crime scene and how O.J. Simpson cut his hand.
That consistent with the glove being removed, this is how this occurrence happened, that during the struggle the glove came off and dropped to the ground. And notice that the knife blade at this point, stick your finger out, would be parallel to where O.J. Simpson's hand would be, and that could come across and cut this incision that was on his finger. Everything is parallel. There's nothing cross-section to it, and this is consistent with the evidence of a struggle, which can happen.
Prosecutors felt that by cutting his own finger, Simpson had inadvertently left a trail of blood that by itself was highly incriminating. That, plus his motive and lack of an alibi, was quite possibly enough to obtain a conviction. But prosecutors still had mostly circumstantial evidence against him. They would attempt to ice the case through DNA collected from the bloodstains. DNA analysis over the last 2 decades had begun to revolutionize criminal investigations. Until recently, blood evidence had limited use in helping identify criminals. By examining what are called the antigens in blood, scientists could determine its type, A, O, B, or AB, but could not trace a blood sample to any one individual. Beginning in the 1980s, science promised to make blood evidence much more significant by examining its DNA. Found in every cell of our bodies, DNA contains the coded instructions of our being. The color of our eyes, our height and hair color, the size of our brain, and so on. Since no 2 humans are alike, except identical twins, it follows that no 2 people have the same set of DNA instructions. By breaking the code, scientists have been able to identify the patterns or markers that distinguish one person's DNA from another's. 2 tests are used to isolate and identify human DNA. One, called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, requires a small sample of blood cells, which are then replicated to produce a larger sample. For the other test, called restriction fragment length polymorphism, or RFLP, researchers must start with a much larger sample of cells. Most of the testing in the Simpson case used the simpler PCR test. Though most courts have accepted DNA evidence, there remains some controversy about its reliability and methods. Like critics of fingerprint science 100 years ago, some question whether we have truly broken the code. In addition to that, DNA science is difficult to explain and, for many jurors, hard to understand. The results of DNA analysis in the Simpson case were stunning. A prosecution expert testified that the drops of blood leading away from the murder scene were probably O.J. Simpson's. The odds the blood came from someone else were calculated at 1 in 170 million. Blood found on the back gate at the murder scene was also identified as Simpson's. Here, the odds of it being someone else's were 1 in several billion, greater than the population of the planet. This essentially proved the blood was Simpson's. Simpson's blood was also identified on the Bronco's door panel, dashboard, and near the headlight switch. Simpson told police he'd last driven the Bronco before dark on the day of the murders. Crime scene reconstructionist Rod Englert.
When do you turn on your headlights? Daytime? Not really. So there was a transfer on that dash which was blood consistent with O.J. Simpson's DNA. But even more remarkable was the console between the passenger seat and the driver's seat. And it had numerous transfer patterns. One was a hand pattern on the back far side of the console, on the console between the passenger seat and the console, which you can see distinctive finger marks, a transfer. And then there's another swipe. These transfers belong to, and it was blood consistent with, the DNA of Ron Goldman and Nicole Simpson.
But for the defense, forensic blood spatter expert Herbert McDonnell testified that he was leery of the blood found in the Bronco because it was so minute.
I don't see how anyone could have been in a struggle with Ron Goldman, or for that matter, Nicole Brown, where the blood was all over the area and not got much more blood on them than was reportedly on Mr. Simpson or in his Bronco. The Bronco, in my estimation, had less than 1 drop total in that whole vehicle.
Regardless of the blood in the Bronco, prosecution DNA tests had identified the ample blood from both murder victims on the glove found behind Cato Kalin's bungalow. The forensic evidence gathered by the police and prosecution pointed a bloody finger at O.J. Simpson. The defense would point its finger at the police. The defense in the Simpson case would focus its attack on a chain of events beginning in the wee hours of June 13, 1994. Defense attorney Barry Scheck contended that what happened, and what didn't happen, in the 24 hours following the murders was enough to cast doubt on the prosecution's case.
There was a lack of coordinated effort between the criminalists, the detectives, and the medical examiners. And you want to make sure that you keep everybody out of that crime scene until you have looked at it carefully, looking for the unexpected, making sure that you have seen absolutely everything before you allow all kinds of brass and supervisors to walk in and out, walk in and out, walk in and out, and begin to destroy the scene.
The defense set out to prove that evidence gathering went from bad to worse.
Well, the significance of the Simpson case lies in the way that crime scene was handled and its implications for the lab work. And we're talking here about the way that the criminalists on the scene collected the evidence, the way it was initially processed in the laboratories, and the way the medical examiner's office dealt with that.
At the scene of the murders on South Bundy Drive, camera crews arrived at 7:30 a.m. Rod Englert believes the cameras were a distraction that seriously affected the way the crime scene was handled.
It's just really difficult to do your job when just a few feet away you've got 15, 20 cameras over your shoulder that's going to be second-guessing you. Well, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about the evidence while you're down on your hands and knees? Or are you thinking about these people shooting up the back of your dress? You see what I'm saying?
Detective Lang, in charge of the investigation, couldn't stop the crews from filming. But he wanted to shield vital crime scene information so it wouldn't become public knowledge. Lang covered Brown's body with a blanket he found in her house. This would draw criticism at trial.
The bodies, of course, themselves are evidence. Blood patterns on the body are evidence. If you have a camera crew show up and videotape that, you've compromised it, and you can't necessarily use that if you had a potential suspect or a witness that you'd interviewed down the line. The media today has lens that could highlight a human hair at 200 feet. You know, we're just honing in on the crime scene, on the one victim, Nicole Brown, in all of the evidence, compromising that evidence. That's one reason that body was covered.
They took a blanket and they put it over the bodies and they brought hairs and fibers all across that scene, when obviously some of the key pieces of evidence in the case might come down to hairs and fibers. Where did they come from?
Only one of the bodies had been covered, and Lang felt his reason was valid.
Did we contaminate it? There's always that possibility, but in this case it was exactly the right thing to do because there was no contamination. There were no foreign hairs, fibers, or debris found on Nicole Brown or her clothing. It was a tightly knit, clean hospital blanket that was used.
The cameras, meanwhile, became a useful tool for the defense.
We were able to get some of the videotape of the cameras looking in as the officers were processing the crime scene, and able to demonstrate that they weren't changing their gloves, that they were commingling some of the evidence, that people were walking in and out of the crime scene at times when they probably shouldn't have been.
The defense began a theme it would stress throughout the trial, that the blood evidence in the case had been contaminated. When blood is shed, bacteria immediately begins to break it down, along with its DNA. The defense suggested improper handling of the blood swatches had allowed the blood to deteriorate too far to permit accurate test results. Chief Criminalist Dennis Fung had relied primarily on swabbing the blood at the murder scene and transferring it to cotton swatches. The swatches were supposed to be dried, then wrapped in cloth bindles for transfer to the lab. But several of the bindles were blood-stained, proving the swatches were wet when placed inside. That could encourage bacterial contamination. Fung also left the blood evidence in his enclosed van for hours without air conditioning in the hot California sun.
And the last thing in the world one should do is put it into a plastic bag and stick it onto a truck, a crime scene truck, and let it bake for 7 hours, because you're going to degrade the DNA there.
That's a terrible mistake from the point of view of a criminalist, isn't it?
Yes.
The theme of contamination was one of the most hotly contested issues at the trial.
Murders do not occur in a sterile lab setting. There was contamination, there always has been. But they would lead you to believe that this somehow affected the outcome of this blood evidence, and the reality of it is it did not. The fact of the matter is, if you're looking strictly at the DNA in this case, you could have collected all of those blood samples and placed them out on Bundy Drive for a month and let the traffic run up and down over them and then collect them. Is that going to contaminate them? Well, sure, it's going to contaminate them. Is that going to change the DNA properties? Is that going to make O.J. Simpson's DNA appear there? No. It's there or it's not there. It's as simple as that.
But Scheck raised another argument, that criminalists at the scene may have commingled some of the blood samples so that no one could say whose blood was whose. Dennis Fung had first collected drops of Simpson's blood at O.J.'s home, then arrived at the murder scene to collect blood samples there. A grueling cross-examination by Barry Scheck raised serious doubts that Fung had changed his gloves, or even worn gloves, while collecting evidence at the murder scene.
And there were some moments during the trial where, I guess the moment that everybody remembers most is that Mr. Fung was picking up that envelope from the scene, and he was claiming that he, of course, did that with his gloves on. All of a sudden, in the courtroom, in a way we'd never even done it before because we had a better video machine in the courtroom, and you could see very, very clearly Dennis Fung grabbing the envelope and touching it without his glove on.
The defense went a step further. It argued that besides the inept collection procedures, more errors were committed when the samples were analyzed. It contended that the handling of the samples in the laboratory was so sloppy that the test results could not be relied upon.
This is a lab that was operating without a protocol, without procedures that people were trained in. Nobody ever taught them how to do it right. That was apparent.
As the defense steadily chipped away at the prosecution's case, another theory began to take shape.
Somebody played with this evidence.
A police conspiracy to frame O.J. Simpson. The mountain of forensic evidence in the Simpson case was turning to rubble. The defense now raised its own theory. Some of the evidence had been planted. The proof began at the gate of Nicole Brown's condominium. According to testimony, the police returned to the murder scene 3 weeks after the murders and found Simpson's blood on the back gate near the bloody shoe prints of the killer. Because it was missed during the initial investigation, the defense suggested it may not have been there at the time of the murder. Detective Tom Lang acknowledges the blood on the gate should have been collected earlier.
Generally at a crime scene, the detective will do a final walkthrough with the criminalists, photography people, latent print people, other detectives who have done canvassing and other things, and they'll walk through, did we do this, did we do that? If that had occurred here, we wouldn't have had the problem with the blood on the rear gate.
During his initial questioning, Simpson consented to giving police a blood sample. The defense suggested someone had planted some of it on the gate. Though presumably exposed to the elements 3 weeks longer, the DNA from the blood on the gate hadn't decomposed as much as the DNA from the blood collected hours after the crime. About the same time Simpson's blood was found on Nicole Brown's gate, Brown's blood was discovered on a pair of socks recovered from Simpson's house the night of the murders. Its significance wasn't missed by the prosecution or the defense. The prosecution's crime scene reconstructionist, Rod Englert, believes the drops of blood were spattered on the socks as Simpson stepped in his ex-wife's blood.
And on the socks we have a projected blood pattern of blood that had to be airborne. When it landed on these socks, creating numerous spots around the ankle and the front of one of them, and numerous match head size spots on the other. Now I don't know which one was right or left, but those spots stopped at where the shoe would be on if it was a regular street size shoe. Those spots stopped at a certain level on both of them where pant legs would be. And so when that was analyzed, I remember Tom Lane calling that evening very excited and said, "We were right. It was Nicole's blood."
To test his theory on how the blood would have been spattered on Simpson, Englert staged a reenactment. To recreate the struggle, he used police officers dressed in white so the blood would show up better. The white set matched the exact dimensions of the murder scene. The violent struggle between the killer and the second victim, Ronald Goldman, took place in close proximity to the deepening pool of blood from Nicole. Englert matched the amount of blood from the crime scene exactly and found that it would have been difficult to avoid spattering, as the test amply demonstrated. Forensics experts Herbert McDonnell and Henry Lee conducted their own examination of one of the socks found in Simpson's bedroom.
The ankle stain was very large. It was not spatter.
Both men claimed the blood had not been spattered at all.
It was not projected there. It was not dripped there. It was not cast off and landed there by flying through the air. It was transferred from contact by something that had blood on it.
Because the blood on the socks was not found between the fibers, McDonnell concluded it had been wiped across the sock.
The margin around the center of that stain shows blood on the surface of the fibers only. It does not show blood permeating between the fibers. Therefore, we know it's transferred.
McDonnell also found evidence that Simpson's foot was not in the sock when the blood transfer took place. McDonnell uses a shirt sleeve to demonstrate how he thinks the blood was applied to the sock. He places a single drop of blood on top of the cloth, which he calls surface 1. He rubs the blood in, and it soaks onto the back, or surface 2. The blood is then transferred to surface 3, but does not soak through to surface 4. McDonnell and Lee found that blood had seeped through from sides 1 and 2 of Simpson's sock onto side 3, which would have been impossible if Simpson's foot had been inside the sock between surface 2 and surface 3. To the defense, this was compelling evidence the blood could have been planted on the sock, either at the crime scene or while the socks were in police custody. The conspiracy theory was supported by defense experts who found the presence of a substance called EDTA in both the blood on the sock and the blood from the gate at the crime scene. EDTA is a preservative added to blood in a test tube to prevent it from clotting. It's also present naturally in small quantities in the human bloodstream. But witnesses testified that the amount of EDTA in the 2 bloodstains was much higher than normal, suggesting the blood on the gate and the socks came from the lab. Down but not defeated, the prosecution brought out its most dramatic evidence.
We can find the mate to it.
The trial of O.J. Simpson reached a turning point with the pair of gloves. Commingled on them was the blood of both murder victims. According to testimony at trial, one glove was found at the scene of the murders, the other on Simpson's property on Rockingham Drive. But a now infamous courtroom demonstration seriously undermined the evidence. The prosecution team decided to have Simpson try on the gloves in front of the jury. The result was a disaster. The gloves apparently did not fit. The prosecution was forced to scramble for an explanation. A former executive of the company that manufactured the gloves testified that when soaked in blood and allowed to dry, the gloves might shrink 10 to 15%. To see if that was possible, McDonnell tested this theory with an identical pair of gloves.
So I took the gloves that were sent to me and I poured my own blood over these gloves in a controlled condition, so I knew exactly how much blood remained on the gloves. They were really wet. The blood was worked into them and then they were allowed to dry.
Prior to the experiment, McDonnell photocopied the glove to document its size. After the bloody glove dried, he again photocopied it for comparison. It had shrunk less than 1%. Next, he wanted to find out how small the glove would become if it really did shrink as much as the manufacturer claimed. He used the photocopier to reduce the glove to 10 and 15% of its original size. Then he compared the reductions to the original photocopy. The change was enormous. At 15%, the gloves would have shrunk over 1.5 inches. In McDonnell's opinion, the change was too drastic. Since it seemed unlikely that the gloves belonged to Simpson, the defense had an opening to expand its theory of a police conspiracy. It had already suggested that someone had planted blood on the back gate at the murder scene and on the socks from Simpson's bedroom. Now it put forward the theory that the glove found on Simpson's property had also been deliberately planted. Mark Furman had been alone when he found the glove at Simpson's house. He'd also been among the first detectives to arrive at Brown's condominium, where the first glove had been found. The defense suggested that Furman had picked up the second glove at the scene of the murders, taken it with him to Simpson's estate, and planted it on the pathway behind Cato Kalin's bungalow. For LAPD Detective Lang, it would have been impossible for Furman to have found the second glove at the scene of the murders because he was the 13th detective to sign the log.
Because 12 people there before Furman only saw one glove. And it's very logical the way Furman found the glove. He was doing what anybody should have done, following up on an interview with Cato Kalin.
Taking its theory a step further, the defense suggested that before he planted the glove, Furman may have used it to smear the blood of the victims inside Simpson's Bronco. It was a claim that made the LAPD's blood boil.
Mark Furman did not plant any blood. Absolutely. He did not do it. He would have no knowledge how to do that. And there's no evidence of that whatsoever. None. There was no sprinkling of blood in that Bronco whatsoever. There weren't any drops. That was all transfers. And the significance of it was that it was transferred in the patterns consistent with one who had blood on his hands or possible clothing to get in and open the door, open the interior door, turn on the lights, touch over here with a hand transfer, and if implements or something was placed on the seat to be able to do that, someone would have to be so knowledgeable and so cerebral about predicting what was going to happen, that I don't have that capability. I don't know anybody that does, to be able to make it consistent. And then to do it on the socks at the house, impossible.
The defense had no real evidence that the glove was planted, and at first it could provide no motive for Furman to plant it. But that soon changed.
You say on your oath that you have not addressed any black person as a nigger or spoken about black people as niggers in the past 10 years, Detective Furman.
That's what I'm saying, sir.
So that anyone who comes to this court and quotes you as using that word in dealing with African Americans would be a liar, would they not, Detective Furman?
Yes, they would.
All of them, correct?
All of them.
In one of the trial's most dramatic moments, the defense introduced evidence that Furman had expressed hatred toward blacks. The defense had found its final weapon for casting doubt on the prosecution's case. It played the race card. Tom Lang feels the issue of race was irrelevant.
Furman's racism or whatever else Furman is has nothing to do with the two people getting murdered. It's unfortunate he was in the middle of it for the first couple hours, but you have to deal with that. And if you think he's planted evidence or anything else, we need to see evidence of that.
Case number BA097211.
The prosecution had been so certain of its forensic evidence, it had withheld other evidence pointing to Simpson's guilt for fear of exhausting the jury's patience.
A felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson.
But the defense had effectively nullified each piece it presented, claiming it had been contaminated by sloppy handling and a disregard for the procedures established to protect it. On October 3rd, 1995, Orenthal James Simpson was found not guilty of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Tom Lang is convinced the jury disregarded the compelling evidence the prosecution had put forward.
Prosecution proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. I've never seen so much evidence. Even there was a tremendous amount of evidence they didn't put on, but there was a tremendous amount they did. I've never seen that much put on in a case. When a jury comes back in 2.5 hours, it's pretty evident they didn't do what they were instructed to do, regardless of the outcome, regardless if it's guilty or not guilty. They did not do what they were told to do, and the court did not follow up on that.
Defense attorney Barry Scheck feels the jury's verdict was based squarely on reasonable doubt. He believes the way the LAPD handled the evidence was totally inadequate.
People in the forensic community recognized that this was wrong, that these procedures were unacceptable. The more sophisticated the technology, the more powerful the forensic evidence, the greater the importance that these people develop and are able to maintain a high sense of independence and professionalism. That kind of laboratory is the kind of laboratory and the kind of crime scene people that are our best protection for convicting the truly guilty and exonerating the truly innocent.
After Simpson's acquittal, lawyers representing the victims' families in a civil suit would learn from the mistakes of the criminal trial. They would bring in circumstantial evidence not presented earlier, such as the fact that Simpson owned a pair of the expensive Bruno Magli shoes like those that left their imprint at the scene of the crime. The prosecution only had to convince a majority of the jurors beyond a 50% certainty that Simpson was guilty. The prosecution was successful, and O.J. Simpson was found liable for the deaths of Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown. He was required to pay $33.5 million to the victims' families. During the criminal trial, the prosecution had what it believed to be irrefutable evidence. It was wrong. Careless handling and collection techniques robbed the evidence of its power. It served only to raise doubt. The aftermath of the Simpson trial resonated throughout the halls of science. Forensics itself was put on the stand, and it became clear that the most reliable witness can also be the most easily compromised.